husband accepted a Governor General's Award for Architecture on behalf of the building I designed. He thanked his incredible team. He thanked the firm. He even thanked our dog. He did not thank me. I sat 3 rows back in a dress I'd bought on sale at Holt Renfrew, watching the woman who'd been sleeping with my husband squeeze his arm as the auditorium filled with applause. What I did next? I'd been planning for 4 months. I should start at the beginning, or at least the beginning I can point to now, the specific Tuesday in February when everything crystallized. It was -23 outside our office in downtown Ottawa, the kind of cold that makes the city feel like it's holding its breath. I was reviewing the structural drawings for the Hartwell Cultural Center, a commission we'd fought 2 years to win, a project I'd spent 18 months designing from the ground up. The curves of the atrium roof, the load-bearing geometry that made the whole thing sing, that was mine. I had the sketchbooks to prove it, 47 of them, going back to the first napkin drawing at our kitchen table in Westboro. My husband had been the one shaking hands at the groundbreaking. That was fine. He was better at handshakes. What wasn't fine was the email I accidentally opened that afternoon. His laptop was sitting open on my desk. He'd asked me to pull a client file while he was on a call. I found the file. I also found a message thread he'd forgotten to close, between him and our junior associate, a woman I'd hired myself 8 months earlier because her portfolio showed genuine promise. The thread went back 11 weeks. The last message read, "Once the award is announced, we move forward with the restructuring. Holly's name doesn't need to be on the Hartwell project publicly. She was support staff. The board will accept whatever narrative I give them." Holly, that's me, support staff, after 17 years. I closed the laptop. I walked to the window and watched the Rideau Canal from 6 floors up, the ice still solid enough for skaters. I pressed my forehead to the cold glass and breathed until my hand stopped shaking. Then I picked up my phone and called my sister. "I need Margaret Osei's number," I said. "The architect lawyer, the one who handled the Bergeron IP case." My sister knew immediately from my voice not to ask questions. She texted me the number within 30 seconds. That night, I cooked dinner as usual. Pasta. The good kind, with the fresh pappardelle from the market on Dalhousie. My husband came home, poured himself a scotch, told me about his afternoon in the way he always did, a long monologue that required nodding but not listening. I nodded. I listened to everything he didn't say. After he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and a yellow legal pad, and I wrote down everything I knew, everything I suspected, and everything I needed to prove. By morning, I had a plan. Before I get to the night of the awards, I need to tell you who I was before I became invisible in my own firm. I grew up in Halifax. My mother was a draftsperson. She used to bring home blueprints rolled under her arm, and I'd spend Saturday mornings spreading them across the basement floor, tracing the lines with my finger, asking her what each symbol meant. By the time I was 12, I could read a set of drawings faster than most adults. I got into Dalhousie's architecture program at 17, finished top of my class, then went to University of Toronto for my master's. That's where I met my husband. He was in the MBA program. Bright, charismatic, the kind of man who makes a room feel warmer just by entering it. He had an idea for an architecture firm that was different, more community-driven, more responsive to Canadian landscapes and Indigenous design principles. It was a good idea. I told him so. What I didn't realize then was that he was better at describing the idea than doing the work behind it. We married at 30. We opened the firm at 31, using a combination of my RRSP savings and a small business loan I'd co-signed. His name went first on the door because he said it sounded better phonetically. I let that one go. I let a lot of things go, one at a time, for 16 years, until I couldn't see the pile anymore because it was taller than I was. The Hartwell Cultural Center was supposed to change things. It was my proof of concept, the project that would make people see who actually ran the design side of our practice. I'd written the competition brief myself. I'd led every client presentation. I'd spent 3 consecutive weekends at the site in Kanata and whether no sane person would work in, because the orientation of the building depended on understanding exactly how the afternoon light moved across that particular piece of land. When the nomination for the Governor General's Medal in Architecture came through, I assumed it would be filed jointly. I assumed a lot of things back then. It was my junior associate, I'll call her what she was, the woman my husband was sleeping with, who first suggested to the jury that he was the lead creative vision. I found this out from Margaret, my lawyer, who has sources in places that would make you reconsider what architects talk about over drinks at conferences. Margaret was 52, wore reading glasses on a chain, and had the calm, precise manner of someone who had seen every variety of professional betrayal and found none of it surprising anymore. At our first meeting, she reviewed my sketchbooks, my email records, my time-stamped digital files, and the annotated project binders I'd kept out of habit since graduate school. "You have a strong case," she said, setting down her pen. "Stronger than you probably realize." "For IP theft?" "For IP theft, for misrepresentation to a professional body, and," she paused, "depending on what your associate's employment contract says, potentially for that as well. What do you want the outcome to be?" I hadn't let myself answer that question yet. I sat in her office on Spark Street while the winter traffic moved outside, and I made myself actually think about it. "I want my name on that building," I said finally, "and I want the firm." She nodded, like this was entirely reasonable. "Then let's make sure you're holding the documentation when the moment comes." The moment I chose was the awards ceremony at the National Art Center. It was April by then, the snow finally conceding to mud season, the tulips on Major's Hill just starting to show. The Royal Architectural Institute of Canada event was a black-tie evening attended by every significant firm principal in the country. My husband had reserved a table for 8. I had quietly arranged a few of the other seats myself. Here's what he thought the evening would be: a triumph, his name on the citation, his hand on the award, a speech he'd rehearsed that graciously acknowledged his team without naming me specifically, and afterward a quiet dinner with her somewhere on Elgin Street celebrating in private. Here's what I'd actually arranged over the preceding 4 months. I had met with the ARAC's Ethics Committee, not to file a formal complaint, not yet, but to alert them to a potential issue of misattribution on a submission. I had provided documentation. They had asked very careful questions. They had thanked me for bringing it forward. I had met 3 times with our 2 largest clients, the City of Ottawa infrastructure team and a private developer in Gatineau, and I'd walked them through the actual design process for every significant project we'd built together. I brought the sketchbooks. I brought the time-stamped AutoCAD files. I brought photos of me on site in a hard hat in the snow. By the end of those meetings, both clients had sent formal letters to our firm's board of directors. Yes, we had a 3-person board, a technicality I'd quietly used to my advantage, indicating that their future contracts were contingent on my continued creative leadership. I had retained Margaret to prepare a formal application to the ARIC to amend the Hartwell Award citation to include my name as lead designer. The application had been filed 2 weeks before the ceremony. The ARIC's legal counsel had been in contact with Margaret daily. I didn't know exactly what would happen that night, but I knew that, whatever happened, I would not be invisible. I had also spoken, twice, with our firm's board chair, a semi-retired architect in Kingston, who'd known me since I was a student and explained the situation in detail. He was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then he said, "I should have seen this sooner. I'm sorry, Holly." He agreed to be present at the ceremony. The one thing I hadn't planned was that she would be there too. My husband had listed her as his executive associate on the seating request. She arrived in a silk dress the color of champagne, wearing a pair of earrings I recognized yellow-gold drop-set diamonds. I had admired them in the Burke's window on Ratto last autumn while we were walking to a client dinner. He must have noted that, filed it somewhere, and retrieved it later for different purposes. Looking at those earrings, I felt something click into place. The last loose piece. I had suspected she might be there, but seeing it confirmed something in me that was still trying to rationalize, still trying to extend the margin of generosity I no longer had reason to extend. I smoothed my dress Steve green, fitted, the kind of thing I wore when I needed to feel entirely like myself, and I waited. The room was full by 7:30. Drinks, canapes, the low hum of professional conversation. I moved through it easily, speaking to people I'd known for years, colleagues from Dalhousie, clients, a former professor now on the RAC board. My husband tracked me across the room with the expression of a man who was performing ease very hard. He had no idea what I had done. He thought I didn't know. He had spent 4 months carefully maintaining the performance of our marriage while systematically erasing me from my own work, and he had assumed I was either oblivious or compliant. He had forgotten, I think, what I was actually like. We sat. The program began. There were 5 awards before the medal I cared about, and I sat through each one with a composure I had practiced in the bathroom mirror enough times that it had become second nature. He sat beside me at the table, his hand occasionally resting near mine in what looked from the outside like affection. She sat 2 seats down, angled slightly toward him in a way that spoke its own language. When they announced the Hartwell citation, my husband rose. I rose at the same moment. He looked at me. For the first time in months, I think he actually looked at me. "Holly," he said quietly in the tone he used when he thought I was making a mistake. "Sit down," I said just as quietly, and then I walked toward the stage. What happened next was not a scene. That's what I want to be clear about. There was no shouting, no thrown drink, no moment of public ugliness. What there was instead was this. The RIC's president, a woman I had spoken to twice in the preceding weeks, stepped to the microphone as I approached and said, "Before we present this medal, we want to acknowledge that the citation is being amended, effective this evening, to reflect the documented creative contributions of lead designer Holly Mercer-Walsh, co-founder of Walsh Mercer Architecture." The room was quiet in a specific way, the way a room gets quiet when people understand that something true is being said in public for the first time. I took the award. It was heavier than I expected, a bronze cast of clean angles. I stood at the microphone and I looked at the audience, all of those people who had watched me stand quietly behind my husband for 17 years at exactly these kinds of events. "The Hartwell Center was designed to hold complexity gently," I said. "I hope it does, thank you." I walked off the stage holding it. My husband did not follow me. He sat at the table and, by all accounts from people who were watching, he did not move for a very long time. She leaned toward him and said something. He shook his head once, briefly, and she stopped talking. The board chair found me in the lobby near the coat check, still holding the award. "The board is meeting next week," he said. "I think you know the agenda." "I do?" I said. "You should bring Margaret." "I will." He paused, a kind man with a long memory. "You built something real, Holly. It was always real, even when the record didn't show it." I thanked him. I put on my coat. I walked out through the main doors of the NAC into the Ottawa night, the air still carrying that particular early April bite that reminds you winter hasn't entirely forgiven you yet. The river was lit. There were still patches of ice on the Quebec shore. The days that followed moved quickly in the way that days do when every hour contains something that matters. Margaret filed the formal IP claim by end of week. The RAIC formally amended the award citation and issued a statement carefully worded, institutional in tone, but clear in its meaning. The Ottawa Citizen ran a piece in the business section. Architectural Record contacted me for an interview. I agreed to both. My husband's calls, I let go to voicemail for the first 3 days. On the 4th day, answered, because avoiding things has never been my nature, and I was done letting it become one. "What you did," he started, "was accurate," I finished. He was at the house, our house, the 1920s 4-square in Westboro that we'd renovated together, or rather that I had project managed while he attended the design review meetings. "The board is forcing a restructure. You know that means the firm becomes Walsh Mercer with me as principal partner," I said. "Yes, I've seen the proposal." "Holly," his voice dropped in that way it did when he was trying to make me feel like I was being unreasonable. "We built this together." "We did," I said. "And then you tried to unmake it, and now we're here." There was a long silence. "I didn't think you'd actually do it," he said finally. You always held back." "I know," I said, and that was the truest thing I said in that whole conversation. Because it was true. I had held back for years, out of love, and then out of habit, and then out of something I mistook for practicality. I had let him have the handshakes and the speeches and the awards dinners, and I had told myself it was fine, it was partnership, it was just the way things worked. And maybe in the first few years it even was. But at some point, he had stopped thinking of it as partnership. At some point, I can't name the exact moment he had started thinking of it as his. I found out later from our bookkeeper that he had also been billing certain personal expenses through the firm's operating account. Not enormously, not the kind of thing that would draw a CRA audit on its own, but enough. A ski weekend in Whistler. Flights that had nothing to do with clients. The earrings, as it turned out, appeared on a vendor invoice as client hospitality. Margaret added this to the file. "Do you want to pursue it criminally?" she asked at our next meeting. I thought about it for a while. "No," I said. "The civil claim and the professional consequences are enough. I'm not interested in destroying him. I'm interested in building something without him in it." She nodded. "That's a reasonable distinction." She also told me, a few days later, that my junior associate had retained her own lawyer and was unlikely to be a problem going forward. I didn't ask for details. I had thought, briefly, about saying something to her directly. She was young. She had been ambitious in the way I recognized, and I was not without sympathy for how someone like her might have been shaped by someone like him. But I also knew I had nothing to say to her that would matter more than the consequences she was already facing. And I chose to spend my energy elsewhere. The firm restructure took 6 weeks and involved more conference calls than I ever want to think about again. What emerged at the end of it was a company with my name first on the door, a clean client list, and a project pipeline that was mine to direct. He retained a minority stake, the lawyers negotiated that, and we agreed to a formal separation. We would sort out the house and the personal finances through a separate process. 17 years of a life built together don't untangle cleanly, and I'm not going to pretend it was simple or that I didn't sit in my car in the firm's parking lot on the day the restructure was finalized and cry for 20 minutes before going inside. But I went inside. The first thing I did as sole principal of the firm was call the Hartwell Cultural Center's facilities manager and ask if I could come by for a walkthrough. She said, of course. I went on a Friday morning in late May when the light was doing what I'd designed it to do, moving through the atrium in a slow diagonal, catching the cedar panel walls and turning them amber. I stood in the middle of the space I had made, and I put my hand on the wall and I stood there for a while. There's a particular satisfaction in work that holds up, that does what you intended it to do, that exists in the world as a material fact regardless of what anyone says about it or who takes credit for it. The building was real. It had been real before the award and before the amendments and before any of this. It would be real long after. I am not someone who believes in clean endings. Life doesn't do those, and I have always been suspicious of anyone who claims otherwise. What I have instead is this: a firm that carries my name, a pipeline of work I'm proud of, a sister who still texts me too early on Saturday mornings, and an award that now has both the story it should always have had and my signature on the citation. Sometimes I still drive past the building at dusk just to see the light moving through it. That was mine. It still is. There's a thing that happens when you spend years making yourself smaller for someone else's comfort. You stop noticing you're doing it. It becomes the shape of your days, the way you route around your own instincts so automatically that you start mistaking the detour for the road. I think about that a lot now. Not with bitterness, mostly, though I won't pretend bitterness wasn't part of it, especially in those first months. What I think about more is the question of how I let it go on so long. I was not naive. I was not passive by nature. I had built real things with my hands and my mind, and I knew the difference between contribution and decoration. And yet I had allowed myself to be filed quietly under the second category year after year because it was easier than the fight, and because I loved him, and because I kept believing the situation would correct itself if I just kept doing good work. Good work, I have learned, does not correct injustice on its own. It has to be paired with something else, with the willingness to stand behind what you've made and say, clearly and without apology, "This is mine." That willingness is not something I was born with. I had to choose it deliberately, the way you choose to get up on a cold morning when everything in you wants to stay under the covers. Margaret helped. The board chair helped. But mostly it was a choice I had to make alone, in the quiet of my kitchen at 2 a.m, staring at a legal pad and deciding what kind of person I was going to be when this was over. What I did wasn't dramatic in the way people sometimes imagine these things. I didn't confront anyone in anger. I didn't make threats or scenes. What I did was methodical. I gathered evidence. I retained counsel, I spoke to clients and colleagues, I filed the appropriate paperwork with the appropriate bodies, and I showed up at the National Arts Center in a green dress and waited for the moment I had prepared for. The calmness wasn't indifference. It was the result of knowing exactly what I had done and exactly what I could prove. That's the part I want people to understand, if they take anything from my story. The outcome wasn't luck, and it wasn't revenge in any satisfying cinematic sense. It was the consequence of decisions made over 4 careful months by someone who finally decided her own work was worth defending. When you act from that place, from clarity about what is true and what is right, rather than from hurt or impulse, the results tend to hold. They hold because they're grounded in something real. I still drive past the Hartwell Center sometimes. The light through the atrium does exactly what I designed it to do. It always did. The building didn't need a corrected citation to be what it was, but I did. I needed to say out loud and on the record I made this, not for the award, for the part of me that had been told in 100 quiet ways that I hadn't. If you find yourself in a room where your contributions are being written out of the story, know this: the record can be corrected. It takes patience, and it takes nerve, and it takes being willing to walk toward the stage when every instinct trained into you says to sit back down. But it can be done, and the version of you that exists on the other side of that walk is worth the effort of becoming.